All right, well, welcome everybody.
Welcome.
Hope we're all doing well, staying safe, even though they're opening up the pools, but I'm not running out there to go swimming. So I did want to announce, I mentioned it to Ruth Ann. I won't be available next week, so this class won't meet next week. I saw something about a conversation on the 21st. Ruth Ann?
The Thursday conversation. Yeah, it's every Thursday morning.
Okay, that's the Thursday morning thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fine. But this class won't meet this week. Next week we'll meet 2 weeks on the 28th, which happens to be Erev Shavuot. The festival of Shavuot begins that Thursday evening. So I'll kind of plan something a little special for the text study that we'll do that afternoon in preparation for the holiday. I wanted to, well, where we've gotten up to in this who, what, why, when, how agenda or curriculum, if you will. We were talking extensively last week about the Jewish concept of prayer. We talked about how it's not necessarily for God's sake, and rather it's for our sake. And we've talked about the history of the prayer book, and that going all the way back. The basic order goes all the way back to the Mishnah, more than 2,000 years ago. That is the basic order, and which is where we get the word Sidur. If you remember from Passover, remember the word Seder, which is the order of the Seder and the ritual on Passover night. The Sidur is the book that contains this basic outline. And then what we need to keep in mind, and I mentioned a couple of weeks ago also, is that Jewish history or Jewish literature, whichever way you want to look at it, has, amongst other dichotomies and amongst other different sources of intellectual tension, we have the balance between what the rabbis call keva and kavanah. Keva is that which is fixed and established, the pattern. These are the words, these are the formulas, these are what you must say under such and such a circumstance and in such and such an order. But the rabbis, matter of fact, it comes from Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers that we're reading this time of year anyway. It says, Al ta'aset tfilatcha keva. Don't just make your prayers only the recitation of the formulas and of the prayers that you might find in the book or that you might have memorized by rote throughout the years. You also have to include the kavanah. You have to include that which is personal, that which is intentional, private, meditational, however you want to describe it. And then what happens over the centuries is that some of those private prayers of the famous rabbis, for example, or of the master poets, become so familiar to people that they become part of the keva. They become part of the order that a particular congregation or community might include. And when they publish their own prayer book, it's not just in the 20th or 21st century that temples or synagogues or communities publish their own prayer books, but many of them did. So here's the prayer book for Vilna, and here's the prayer book for Rome, and here's the prayer book for Morocco, or Jerusalem, wherever it might have been. They wound up starting to include prayers, poetry, what they call iyunim, I guess, insights or meditative readings that the rabbi or the teacher, whatever, and everyone became so familiar with them that they were included in that prayer book. And so the prayer book went from being only probably, the equivalent of 5 or 6 pages long to now we're all familiar with the size of the prayer book. And it's not just the Reform or Conservative or the Liberal prayer book. The Orthodox prayer books are filled with many of these additional prayers that were originally Kavanah prayers, and they've been added on to the Keva. The prayer books with which we're most familiar are a little more than 1,000 years old, going back to the 9th and 10th centuries, whether it's the daily prayer book, the Shabbat prayer book, or the High Holy Day prayer book, which is called the Machzor. And then certainly as of the 1500s, once the printing press is in, has become a new advance in the industrial society, more people can have their prayer book at home, and you get into the actual what we call the nusach, or the particular pattern, whether it's a musical pattern or whether it's the as my professor, I introduced you to the word last year, the dramaturgy of how a particular service might go, because there's difference between the European and the South American, or the North American and the South African, and the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi. Everybody has their own little pattern or their own little nusach. So that's an overriding kind of explanation. Let me go through the basic form, or this basic structure of a service. And this doesn't matter whether it's Ashkenazi, Sephardi, whether it's 21st century or whether it's 10th century, but the same structure pretty much holds sway as the basic siddur, the basic order of the prayers as they appear in almost all the prayer books. The differences are going to be mostly in the translation. They'll be in how much additional commentary or explanation the particular book might have. Like we're familiar with the prayer books that we see now, like one page may have the traditional Hebrew, the other page may have an interpretive contemporary translation or some poetry that modifies or enhances the theme of the original Hebrew. But the order, the basic outline is the same. It begins and we use the morning service as the basic pattern, even though you remember that a Jewish day is marked the evening. It begins the evening before, but and there is an evening worship service, but this basic pattern that we're talking about for the Siddur follows the morning service. Begins with morning blessings, some of which we're all familiar, even in the Reform or the very liberal prayer books. The morning blessings were originally intended to be recited at home. They begin when you awaken. Thank you, God, for returning my soul that's been asleep, and I was only hoping that it would that I would arouse again in the morning. Modeh ani, I'm very grateful that you, God, that you have reawakened my soul. And then prayers when we go to the bathroom, prayers when we first eat, etc., etc., etc. Followed by other psalms or readings that for some individuals were still read or recited at home. Some were recited on the way of walking from, because you didn't Uber in those days. So walking from your home to the synagogue, or some of them then were recited as people arrived at the synagogue, and they could wait for the full minyan to be there before the formal worship began. So there's a section in the morning service also called Pesukei de Zimra. They were mostly sung. The one with which most of us are familiar is the psalm that begins Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha Od Yahalalucha Selah. Happy are those who dwell in your house; they will continually praise your name. And it goes on and on and on. It's frequently done antiphonally or responsively. There's a familiar melody, dum 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 dum. Whether, and it works in English incidentally, but that's the most famous of the Pesukei de Zimra. There are many others, but it's kind of a time filler so that everyone could arrive at the synagogue in time for the more formal part of the worship. That begins with, so I have to introduce you to a word that I may have mentioned before, rubric. When scholars or people talk about the different parts of the worship service, the traditional worship service, they talk about the various rubrics. So this is a particular section of the service. And how do you usually know, not all the time, but how do you usually know when you're moving from one rubric to another? Two ways. One is that's usually the only time that the rabbi or the gabbai, or, well, it wouldn't be the rabbi, or the cantor, or someone, the shliach tzibur, the one who's leading the service, would announce a page. Okay? And it may not be with a page number, they may just say the name of the particular prayer. That's how you know that you're moving from one rubric to another. That's one way. The other way was the recitation of what has come down to be known as Chatzi Kaddish. Okay. Kaddish we all know, and I'll talk about Kaddish in a few minutes, the Kaddish prayer in Aramaic. But when it's and we're familiar that it's a memorial, we can use it as the Kaddish for they call it the orphans Kaddish, Kaddish Yatom. That's the memorial prayer that it's recited at the end of every service. But there's a shorter version, an abbreviated version, if you will. It's about 2/3. That it's referred to colloquially. Did I pronounce that correctly? I don't think so. Colloquially, as Chatzi Kaddish. Chatzi meaning half. But it's really not half. It's more about 2/3. But the Chatzi Kaddish, the more technical term is Kaddish Le'ela. It's the arising, the uplifting Kaddish that marks off the different rubrics. So if we're finishing up these introductory prayers and songs, the morning blessings, Nisim B'chol Yom, the Pesukei de Zimra, whatever, and we're ready to start our formal worship, and someone meanwhile has double checked and counted that we have the minyan, then fine. Then the first official rubric of the formal service is called the Shema and its blessings. We all know about the Shema, but go previous to the Shema, 2 full paragraphs, and then you'll come back. If you're working backwards, you'll come to Baruch Hu, right? What's Baruch Hu? Baruch Hu, some of us remember it being called the call to worship, right? Because the worship leader actually is saying, Baruch Hu et Adonai. It's an invitation, or if you want it, depending on how you want to see it, it also could be the imperative. Praise God, or all who want to praise God, please join us right now. And then everyone responds, Baruch Adonai Barach. We do praise God who is worthy of our prayers now and forever. So that's the official welcome to the formal worship. It's not the main part of the worship, even though we frequently refer to the Shema as watchword of our faith, as the immediate statement of faith, and it's supposed to be on our lips when we wake up and when we right before we go to sleep and right before we die. But the official rubric of the worship service begins at Baruch. Then there are 2 paragraphs afterwards. Then comes the Shema, which leads into V'ahavta. Most of the community these days only includes the first paragraph. There are originally 3 paragraphs of V'ahavta. Most of the liberal community only includes the first and then the last several verses of the 3rd paragraph. Why? Well, one is a theological reason, the other is a practical reason. The practical reason coming first, the practical because it talks specifically about wearing tzitzit and the fringes and things. And in our day, most of the liberal community, at least men or women, do not wear the tzitzit. So to include that particular paragraph seems a little anachronistic, if you will, a little out of character. The other theologically is because it presents, and it's a good topic. Again, when we get to this week's Torah portion, studying from the Torah study class, because talks about a lot of the blessings and the curses. So a lot of the things that if you follow God's commandments, this is what will happen. This is why you should follow God's commandments. And that's not necessarily the theological position of contemporary Jews in the 21st century. Again, that's a topic for a whole different conversation and class. So the Shema and its blessings, and that's followed by a section of the service. Again, this is the daily service following the outline of the morning that includes the familiar Mi Chamocha. It reminds us that we became a people right after we crossed over the Sea of Reeds. So Mi Chamocha, God, you are great. Be our God. Adonai Yimloch Leolam Va'ed. God, be our God. Rule over us forever. And a section of the service that usually includes 1 or 2 readings on the theme of redemption. Redemption, not only in the sense like for our ancestors of finding freedom, but also the freedom then to be a people and to enter into God's covenant the way they will at Mount Sinai. Some of the earlier prayer books, again, not from the Mishnah, but maybe from the Middle Ages, some of the prayer books at that point did include a listing of the 10 commandments, because it was kind of a reenactment of standing at Mount Sinai. But that is one, there are several, but that is one piece of the original order of the service from the prayer books, again, from the Middle Ages, that has dropped, and from the formal worship, from the formal liturgy. Many editions of the Jewish prayer book, the Siddur, these days might include here's the 10 commandments printed at the back, kind of like an appendix, but not necessarily within the worship service itself. Okay, then we would encounter, after that, again in the daily service, we would encounter the one of these Chatzi Kaddish, one of the recitation, the Kaddish La'ela, that would mark off the particular rubric in which we find ourselves, and then that would be followed by the main section of the service. We now call it Ha-Tefillah. I'll say it this way: capital T, capital T. The Tefillah. Tefillah meaning prayer. So this is the prayer par excellence, and it's not just one prayer. It's actually, you might know, in a daily service, it's 19. Used to be 18, but we believe in inflation, so we were able to go from 18 to 19. Okay, much more comprehensive class or opportunity, we could figure out why they changed from 18 to 19. What was the addition? But again, it's easy to follow. There are 3 prayers at the beginning, familiar to all of us. Certainly the first 2 are familiar. We chant them all the time, and we usually use the same melody, whether it's Shabbat, whether it's daytime, whether it's a weekday, or whether it's a festival. We usually start with the preface, Adonai Sifatai Tiftachu, that one. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu. So that's the first paragraph. Then atah gibor le'olam Adonai. That's the second of the 3rd paragraphs. Then the 3rd is usually a very minor one. In the evening, atah kadosh v'shimcha kadosh, and whatever. In the morning service, it's a little more extensive, the kedusha. But the first 3 of this set of what is now 19 prayers, the first 3 are the same, no matter at least thematically are the same, no matter whether it's morning, evening, afternoon, whether it's a holiday, whether it's a festival, whether it's Rosh Chodesh, it's a new moon, whatever. The first 3 are the same, and the last 3 thematically are the same. Thanking a prayer of asking God to receive our prayers, accept our prayers, whether it's the prayer or whether it's, last week we were talking extensively about the Hebrew word avodah, whether it means service, whether it means worship, whether et cetera, et cetera. It has come to be a generic term for divine service or worshiping God. So the 3rd last prayer is the Avodah prayer, asking God to accept our prayers. Then the 2nd last one is prayer of thanksgiving. Modim anachnu lach, we give thanks to you, O God, for the listing of the things that we are thankful for. And then the last one in this section, in this rubric, is the prayer for peace. Now, what has happened in good Jewish fashion is that, as I mentioned before, different communities had different wording, or maybe they liked the way that their particular rabbi expressed, or their particular, the local poet laureate, the way that he or even she might have expressed or a particular prayer. So when we get to the last prayer in this rubric, it's the prayer for peace. In the evening, it's Shalom Rav. In the morning, it's Sim Shalom. They're similar, parallel prayers, if you will. One officially came out of the Ashkenazi community. The other came out of the Sephardic community. And rather than saying that one's more important than the other, when in the last century or 2, as the differences between Ashkenazi and Sephardi have come to be minimalized, so most of the prayer books now recognize this compromise. We'll do one of them in the Ashkenazi form in the evening. We'll do the Sephardi form in the morning with the Shalom prayer, and in 1 or 2 other circumstances throughout the Siddur as well. So when we're talking about, again, what now is 19 prayers, the first 3 and then the last 3, thematically, maybe the wording changes a little bit, but thematically, the first 3 and the last 3 are always the same. So then, I don't know who our math scholar is on the call right now, but 19 minus 6 leaves how many? Anyone? Oh, everyone's muted. You can't. All right. Hold up your fingers. Someone. So
13.
the 19, right, okay. So the 19 minus 6 leaves what is it? Leaves 13, right? Okay. So the middle 13 are mostly, and some of you will remember last week or the week before we were talking about how Jewish prayers simplistically can be reduced into the classification of prayers of praise, of thanksgiving, of petition, and of atonement or repentance. Okay, most of the 13 that are in the middle are prayers of petition. Not all, but most of them are, including prayer for health, including prayer that the sacrificial cult in Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem will be restored. Things like that. They're petitionary prayers. And they're included in the daily worship. On Shabbat and on festivals, those 13 are reduced to 1. And the 1 always has a specific theme to the day, whether it's Shabbat, whether it's Shavuot, as we're going to be celebrating, whether it's Passover, that we did celebrate a while ago, if it's Rosh Chodesh, if it's a particular new moon. So those other 13 are done away with, put aside, and replaced by only one single prayer that usually has strong reference to the particular day, the holiness of the day. It might be Shabbat, might be one of the festivals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's originally this particular hot tefillah, this central part of the worship service, the main part of the worship service, was originally 18 prayers, then it became 19 prayers. And so it was known as the Shmona Esrei, which is the number 18 in Hebrew, until it didn't become 18 anymore. And some very wise, fourth grade student probably said, "Rebbe, why are we calling it 18 when there are 19? It doesn't make any sense." Ah, you're right, Bucher. You're very smart, Bucher. Okay, so let's not call it the Shmona Esrei anymore. And they started calling it the Amidah. The Amidah means the standing prayer. Now, an aside, a digression for a minute, if you will. Contrary to what most people believe, contrary to what most of our rabbis taught us, the Jewish law does not say that we need to stand for any particular prayer at all in the prayer book. We are welcome to stand. We are welcome to sit. There is no halachic statement that for this prayer, whether it's Hatfilah that I'm talking about now, whether it's Kol Nidre, whether it's the Shema, there is nothing in Jewish law that stipulates that we must stand at any particular time. It's all minhag. It's all custom. Okay, so this one particular rabbi in my fictional setting of the smart student who said, or the smart Alex student who said, "Why are we calling it the 18 when there's really 19?" Says, "Okay, let's call it the standing prayer," even though officially one did not have to stand. One was not obligated to stand for these. But in that particular community, synagogue, community, state, country, whatever, it probably was their custom to recite those prayers while they were standing. So it became known as the Amidah also. Okay, all right. So, and we mentioned about the Kaddish Le'elah. So at the time, the way in the pattern of worship that we're most familiar with, at the end of the Amidah, at the end of the Tefillah, we usually have in our nomenclature, in our pattern, we have silent prayer, okay? A time for silent devotion. And then we all come back together again with singing something, Yehi Ratzon or Oseh Shalom or whatever. Traditionally, Kaddish Le'ela, another, because we're marking off the end of a rubric. So again, that Kaddish Le'ela would be the place marker. And the worship leader would now say, okay, and just by saying Yitkadal, although it's pronounced Yiskadal, but Yitkadal v'Yikadash Shmei Rabbah, everybody knew that, aha, we're all coming back together again and moving on to the next rubric. The next rubric being special prayers, which could be for a special day. It could be acknowledging that a holiday was coming up. It could be if they did a special Misha Berach prayer for healing of those in the community who were ill. It could be in most congregations, certainly congregations and communities, certainly in Europe, there was a prayer for the government. Going back into the 1400s, there was a prayer for the ruler, the king, the emperor, whatever it might be, and prepared the community then to join in on Monday, Thursday, or Saturday to join in then for the Torah service. I'm going to talk about that more extensively, either later today or next time we meet. We'll talk about the Torah. But traditionally, the special prayers, many of which that we now use as part of the Torah ritual, they were done before the Torah was taken out of the ark. Those particular special prayers, if you will. After the Torah reading, and again, if it was Monday, Thursday, or Saturday, incidentally, and I say this with all due respect and reference and reverence to my rabbinic colleagues and ancestors, they did not give a sermon. The comments about the sermon, as it were, the rabbi of the community, or the head of the academy, the Rosh Yeshiva, whatever, really would only give 2 basic sermons a year. Easy job, huh? Okay. 2 basic sermons a year. One was on the Shabbat before Yom Kippur, what we call Shabbat Shuvah. And the theme of the sermon was always talking about the importance of repentance and what the specific mitzvot were that related to Yom Kippur. The other day on which the rabbi would give a sermon was Shabbat Hagadol, was the Sabbath right before Passover, and we'll talk about the uniqueness and the holiness of the Passover experience and what's kosher and what's not, what's kosher for Pesach, what's not, and the basic theme that where Elijah comes to tell that the generations will return. No, I'm sorry. That's the Yom Kippur one. But Shabbat Hagadol, referring specifically to the Passover experience. After the kind of sermon that we're talking about in our day and age was usually given at either late Saturday afternoon before they came to the last service, the Mincha Mariv service, and then Havdalah. There was a little practice called the Malava Malka. That's accompanying. Remember when we sang Lecha Dodi, we were welcoming the bride on Friday night as a queen or as a bride. Well, if we welcomed her in, well, when she's leaving, we have to escort her out. So the Malava Malka was kind of a celebration, which of course involved food and drinking some schnapps or whatever. And that's when the rabbi would usually give the kind of sermon, Devar Torah, or it might have ethical connotations. It might be coming out of the Musar kind of kind of orientation, but that would usually be given late Saturday afternoon rather than on a Friday night or a Saturday morning kind of service. Then after that, so after the Torah ritual, guess what? We would have a Kaddish La'ela again, so that the people who had walked out and were standing out in the lobby or whatever would know, aha, they're doing Kaddish, we have to go back in. Aleinu, the prayers of adoration, and then the recitation of a memorial mourner's Kaddish, if you will. But that wasn't the end. That wasn't the end of the service. Then they would usually sing one or two more hymns. I suppose that the president or whomever was the important leader of the community would give some announcements, or just as we do these days, although some of our presidents do it reluctantly. Hi, Ruthann. But we still it's an old tradition, and then they would come back to another form of Kaddish that I'll relate to in a few minutes, and then the service would be technically done as a morning service. Okay. Remember that Jewish tradition talked of having 3 services during the day, an evening service, a morning service, and an afternoon service. The afternoon service, which we called mincha, and on the one hand, it comes from the same word as menucha, that means rest, but mincha is actually a gift, and it refers to the biblical practice of one of the sacrifices that was brought to the temple in the afternoon. It can be performed anytime from 12:30. Don't necessarily ask me why 12:30, although that was probably the approximate time, noon, because noon, midday was an identifiable time of day for the ancients. And it was probably the time when those who were on guard, when they shifted their duty. So it was time for one shift to leave and the next shift to come in, and that's probably why the ancients talked about a 12:30 time, when from 12:30 until sunset. Anytime in that framework, you could offer the mincha service. It began with just one token psalm from the Pesukei de Zimra, from the introductory psalms in the morning. Again, usually that Ashrei, Psalm 150, and then continued to included the quote unquote the Shemona Esrei, the 18/19 prayers, and the conclusions, the adoration, the Aleinu, and whatever. Some communities specifically, and it probably was a matter of convenience, some communities particularly would identify that there would be a mourner's Kaddish in the afternoon service. Most did not. They included what we call the full Kaddish, but it wasn't necessarily where the mourners would be identified. And again, because the mourners were not in the synagogue, the mourners were at home. That's what, during the period of Shiva, the community comes to them, and the worship service, the daily services, whatever, would be at the house of mourning. Doesn't necessarily mean that all the mourners in the community or those who were observing yahrzeit would be coming to the Shiva house. The evening service, the Ma'ariv service, sometimes certainly in the last generation or two, we frequently go from one into the other, Mincha Ma'ariv. So that if the Mincha service leads up to sunset, and then right around sunset is when you begin the Ma'ariv service. There's a great deal of repetition, and I wouldn't say redundancy, because it's not necessarily overkill, but there is repetition in the Ma'ariv service. Technically, you're supposed to not really begin the Maori service until 3 stars appear, or until, if it's a cloudy day, how do you know that 3 stars have appeared? Until someone who is acknowledged or authorized by the community to say, okay, I hereby announce that sunset has arrived. Now, digression again. A few months ago, when we were having some of these conversations, the question arose, could a woman be the one who would announce that sunset had arrived, for example? Or could a woman be the one who would say, aha, it's a new moon. There's the new moon, I see it, and I can acknowledge that. And those of you who've been part of this discussion for this length of time will remember that no, a woman was not obligated to serve in that role. If the community acknowledged her, she could, but usually that was not the case. Why? Because they didn't want, the overriding statement they made was that women are exempt from those mitzvot or those obligations that are specifically time bound. The community needed someone to say, again, let's use the example of, it's cloudy, we don't know we don't know exactly what time sunset is. This is not 2020, we're talking of 1,000 years ago or whatever. And again, I would defer to David, as you know, as to how they really understood the calendrical cycle and whatever 1,000 years ago, and whether they could ascertain at what time, in what place, as we can do today, and in what time and what place sunset would officially begin. So okay, but in those days, the community would have to say, all right, yes, we will accept a woman, but most likely they said not, because they didn't want to put the woman in the situation of having to make a spot decision if the community's counting on her to be the one to say it's sunset, but at the same time, her newborn baby is crying and she needs to go attend to the baby or nurse the baby or whatever it might be. So they didn't want the woman to feel that she had that pressure and had to choose. So they said women are exempt from those obligations or those ritual obligations that are time bound. Women still are obligated to perform mitzvot, but not the ones that have to be done at a specific time, because they might have this, the competition of where their loyalty, where their attention should be. Okay, so 3 stars appear in the sky, and at that point, we can begin our Maori prayers. We don't need any of the introductory prayers because we've already recited them at Mincha, which did begin with Baruch Hu. So the Maori service just begins with the Shema and then continues with the Amidah and concluding prayers. And frequently, yes, that did include the mourner's Kaddish. Okay, let me give a few more comments about Kaddish, then we'll pause for a minute and see where we are time-wise. So there are actually, when we hear the word we, again, the North American mainstream Jewish community, when we hear the term the Kaddish, are we going to recite Kaddish? We're usually talking about the mourner's Kaddish. In Hebrew, it's called the Kaddish Yatom. It's the orphans Kaddish. That's the formula. That's the doxology. That's the praise of God and thanksgiving to God with which we are most familiar. It is 90% in Aramaic rather than in Hebrew. The last phrase, the Oseh Shalom phrase, is in Hebrew, but the rest of it is in Aramaic, which again is loosely is a combination of Hebrew and Greek. There was an attempt, coincidentally, back in the 60s and early 70s, there was a proposal that in modern Israel, they should rewrite the Kaddish prayer into spoken Hebrew. So in other words, and many of you, as I'm looking at pictures, many of you probably, like I, when we first learned to recite Kaddish, it was in the Ashkenazi form of Yiskadal, the Yiskadash, Shmei Rabbah. Technically, in the Aramaic pronunciation, it should be more of a, rather than an S, it should be more of a TH. Yiskadal, the Yiskadash. But that's, again, that's besides the point. But in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a proposal that got as far as the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, that whether they should rewrite and throughout Israel now start to pronounce Kaddish as Yit Gadel, the Yit Kadesh, Shmo Hagadol. And it just didn't, it didn't fly. It did not fly. It's one of those statements, one of those prayers that everyone was comfortable with, pronounced the way that we had all the time that we first learned it. They were not going to change it into the modern Hebrew. But again, the one with which most of us are familiar, and when we hear the word or the term Kaddish, we're referring to the mourner's Kaddish. Then, as I said earlier, there's this Kaddish Le'ela, or the Chatzi Kaddish, that marks off each, it's a place marker, if you will, that marks off each of the different rubrics in the service. There can be 3, there can be 5 or 6, depending on which it usually is. The original form of the Kaddish prayer, as we know it, is actually called Kaddish de Rabbanan, the rabbi's Kaddish, if you will. It does appear in the Babylonian Talmud. So that, in other words, we know that we're talking of at least 1,600 years ago. And it was a statement of God, doesn't refer to death at all. Not at all. It was a kind of a statement at the end of every study session, at the end of every time that a group of students were studying with a rabbi. And it came to be associated as the rabbi would not be saying the words, the students would be saying the words as a statement of honor and respect and appreciation to the teacher. There are some stories in the Talmud of, one student asks, well, what if we don't think that our teacher is worthy of hearing this prayer? And then there's a long debate about whether they should still say it. Again, that's time for some other study. But when we talk about a statement of simple belief, belief in God, belief in the goodness of the world, belief in the sanctity of life, that's Kaddish de Rabbanan, because there's an additional paragraph. We only recite it, again, in contemporary mainstream North American Judaism. We really only recite it at the most once a week, if not, in some congregations and communities, only once a year on the high holy days. But it includes a phrase of Al Yisrael, Ba'al the Rabbanan, Ba'al the Right, and that we give special thanks to the teachers of Israel, to the teachers of Torah, etc., etc., etc. Okay, then so we've got the Kaddish de Rabbanan. That's the original one. That's for the rabbis. We have the Chatzi Kaddish, a Kaddish Le'ela, That's that marks the difference between rubrics. We have Kaddish Yatom. We have the Mourner's Kaddish, with which we are most familiar. There are two others. Okay, the Kaddish Shalem, which you know the word shalom or shalem, which means whole or complete. So the wording is this is the completion. In other words, this is the last at the end of the service, because frequently in the prayer books that we have, the Mourner's Kaddish was not at the end of the service. They would say Mourner's Kaddish, and then, as I was jokingly said before, there might be announcements, there might be a few other kinds of things, kiddush, whatever might happen, and then Kaddish Shalem, the completing Kaddish. Everyone, just like the students of old at the end of an academy session, the students would praise God for allowing them to study Torah. This Kaddish Shalem allows all of us to acknowledge that we've had this privilege of worshiping together, and we praise God. So that's number 4. Number 5 is the Kaddish Le'it Chadata, or again, if you're pronouncing it correctly in Aramaic, Le'ith Chadafa. The best way to translate it would be the uniting Kaddish. The wording is very, very similar. There are only 1 or 2 little phrases that are added. It does still appear in some High Holy Day machzorim, just to appear once to be used. Sometimes it's at the very end of Nila, the very end of the Nila service, the very end of Yom Kippur. But if you think about it, and you can make your own connection to that prayer, it's the uniting Kaddish. It's for all of us to unite together, to become one with God. It's an extended form of the Mourner's Kaddish, of Kaddish Yatom. It is only used, again, either at the end of a major time. It might be the end of the whole community being together for Yom Kippur. So they would use this particular wording to unite everyone as a statement of that we are all together. They might do it. Some of you may be familiar of the practice of what's called a siyum, when a particular group, and they were doing it around the world thanks to Zoom, of finishing the study of a tractate of the Talmud, for example. So when there are people from all over the world, or people who normally aren't together, but when they are together and want to have some kind of a concluding statement that unifies them all, they'll use the wording of this particular Kaddish, the Kaddish Le'it Chadata, the Kaddish that makes us one, is literally what it means. Okay, there are really 2 more areas that I wanted to get into, still talking about within the general context of prayer and the prayer book and the worship service. Let me do one. Let's talk about one. We'll save the other one to start 2 weeks from today before we and that'll make a nice segue. So some of you know or remember or may have even participated in a section of the service. It's not in the daily section unless you happen to worship or grew up in a Sephardic congregation, because the Sephardim still do this every week on Shabbat. But in the Ashkenazi community that most of us participate in, there is the ceremony that's called duchening. Now, duchening is when the rabbi, nowadays, although technically according to the Torah and according to Jewish law, it's not the rabbi who gives this blessing, it's the priest. It's the Kohen, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, or the Kohen Tzedek, or anybody from the priestly class, anybody who is descended from a Kohen. And of course, sadly, we're talking about the men at this point. It's called duchanin because a duchan is the platform on which, as opposed to the bima, which I would translate, I guess, as the altar in the synagogue or in the sanctuary, but the duchan was the reader's platform from which the service was conducted, not necessarily in front of the aron, in front of the ark. On certain occasions, we'll talk about when, on certain occasions, those who were of the priestly class, and Kohen, Khan, would come up onto the platform. They would cover their faces, cover their eyes with their talit, and they would recite and bless the congregation with what we call the priestly blessing from the book of Numbers. Everybody's familiar with it. In Hebrew, it's Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishma. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord watch over you and be kind to you. May the Lord lift up the divine countenance upon you and grant you peace. Okay, so the words come from the book of Numbers. It's one of the roles that's specifically assigned to Aaron and his sons, Aaron the priest and his sons. And God says in the text is, and they should use this formula. They say these words to the children of Israel, and bless them through with my name, through my name. Okay. In modern Jerusalem, even to this day, you can, if you go to the Kotel, if you go to the Western Wall, there are usually more than one descendants of the priests who will stand at the Kotel and offer that blessing to anyone who might want the blessing. Again, in the Ashkenazi diaspora community, they usually do this little ritual on high holy days and on the festivals, on the pilgrimage festivals, on Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. But the Sephardim still include this in their regular Saturday morning service. It's a high moment. It's a moment of great pageantry for those who still participate in it. And again,
Rabbi?
Seen it? Yeah, Lenny. Yeah, please.
Is the Kohen supposed to hold his hands in a certain way,
Yeah.
his fingers?
Yeah, you're anticipating my next sentence.
I'm sorry.
Okay, no, don't be sorry. Okay, all right, so long before Dr. Spock, right, okay, all right, long before Dr. Spock, they used to say that only if you had Kohen or Levi or Levitic blood would you be able to do this, but I know lots of people who can't, all right, but they would cover themselves with their talit. The congregation would turn away or at least cover their eyes because it's such a high moment. Somebody just came to my door. Now this does not come from the Talmud in something. This is not law. This is just a custom that probably sarcastically or sardonically probably was established by some of the people with priestly backgrounds so that they could get a few extra kopecks or shekels, and whatever. Do you want this blessing? Do you want this blessing? Do you want a blessing on your head? Mazel tov, mazel tov. But the Midrash relates it to a quotation from the Song of Songs that where it says that my beloved could be seen through the lattice work. And they translated lattice work and they commented lattice work, that probably means fingers locked together this way. By doing this, it's supposed to represent the Hebrew letter Shin. And I guess the Torah study group, we were talking about the name Shaddai, that God's name, if you will. Leonard Nimoy did come from a Kohen background. That's how he knew how to do this for Dr. Spock. It was his idea. It wasn't from the Star Trek originators. And you will still see in some Jewish cemeteries, you will still see on the tombstones, if you see a depiction of the hands like this, it meant that the person who's buried here was a member of the Kohen tribe. So I did want to point that out. Lenny, does that answer the question of what you're bringing up about? Okay, all right. The other one quick comment is everybody knows about what the Ner Tamid is, right? Okay, every Jewish synagogue has a Ner Tamid, but we incorrectly translate that as an eternal light. It's not an eternal light. It's a regular light. It was lit at regular times. Okay? It's not necessarily that there was always a lamp burning somewhere. There was a lamp that was identified as the Ner Tamid that could be lit, and frequently. So remember, remember the menorah, not the Chanukiah, not the 8-branched candelabrum, but the 7-branched candelabrum, which is the oldest Jewish symbol. It's older than the Magen David and the Star of David. The 7-branched candelabrum has one in the center. Think of Hanukkah. That's the Shamas candle. So the assumption is that that's the Ner Tamid that they were talking about, was the one that would be lit, that could be lit on a regular basis and used to light anything else, whether it was the candelabra, the wicks with the oil, whether it was the fire for sacrifices, but the one stick. But there's nowhere in the ancient tradition does it say that the Ner Tamid was a perpetual light. It was not an eternal light. It was a regular light. It was lit at regular times. Okay. That's it for today. That's it for today. So next, again, I can't meet next week on the 21st, but on the 28th, what I would like to do is talk specifically about the Torah service, the reading of the Torah, how the Torah is divided up, things like that, the aliyot, the various rituals and customs about the Torah service, and then we'll go from that. We'll segue into the next major section of this curriculum that I wanted to talk about is some introductory things about classical Jewish text. So we'll start with Torah, we'll start with Bible, and then go on to the halachic literature, the legal literature, the interpretive literature, the midrash, then the Mishnah and the Talmud, how that develops, and then the codes, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A little bit what we say in Hebrew, like beklei hamazleg, a little bit of like in Yiddish, the Vorspice, a little bit of an appetizer, tweaking your interest, I hope, in some of these collections of the text. And then once we're finished with this whole section, then maybe we'll find, okay, we'd like to pursue Midrash, or we'd like to pursue a little bit of an introduction to Mishnah, or wherever it would go. A never-ending story. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're very welcome. Thanks for tuning in. Stay healthy, everyone.
Yes.
Is there any time for questions?
I just have a couple of minutes. I have to get on another call in 5 minutes. But go ahead.
Oh, I don't know. This may be a big one, but just very curious about other than the Duchan or Duchanim that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Differentiating Sephardi tradition. If there's something else about in the Sephardi tradition aside from Ashkenazi, and it's always puzzled me a bit. There is at least one Hasidic a group that actually, and I don't remember which one, but it uses Nusach Sfarad.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, even though they're Ashkenazi.
Um, I know a little bit about them going back to Bulgaria, believe it or not, that the Bulgarian Hasidic community was strongly influenced by the Sephardic customs. Now, how that
Oh.
happened, I don't know, but I'm talking about the end of the 18th century. But how they shifted more towards, and I know that because the chief rabbi of Bulgaria was Sephardic. Okay, so by that time, by the 1780s, the chief rabbi of Bulgaria was Hasidic, but was Sephardic. But exactly where it came from earlier than that, I don't know. But yes, you're right. There are some Hasidic communities, and if any of you were watching this Israeli-based television series called Surugim, I don't know, Steve, are you watching that?
I've seen it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So Surugim, which are the knitted yarmulkes that the modern Orthodox wear. One of the characters, not all, but one of the characters has a Sephardic orientation. And he had interacted with one of these particular Hasidic sects that represented the Sephardic. But I don't know the history behind it at all. But you're right, they certainly do. Some of the Ethiopians also have bringing some of their own melodies and their own interpretations, and those that have what's the word, affiliated, that have decided to follow some of the Hasidic teachings. They've melded the Ethiopian, the Beit Yisrael stuff with them too. It's fascinating. Okay, thanks everybody. Be well.
Okay.